science is questioning and disagreeing. I'm Mayla Boguslav and I study science. I ask questions such as, what is science? How do we measure the success of science? The goal of my podcast is to highlight what scientists do through what they are passionate about, research questions. So I'm going to ask them a bunch of questions about the research questions, and at the end, the scientists will reveal what field they are from. And maybe you'll be able to guess the field and maybe you won't. Welcome to the Ignorance Podcast, where we learn about science through research questions. Let's welcome our guest scientist for today. Please introduce yourself by name only and tell us your favorite thing to do outside of work.
Hi, I'm James Wilson, and I think I'm surprised that some of my favorite things that I used to do outside of work were things like puzzles, but my son recently drugged me into a Taekwondo studio to do Taekwondo with him. And while I'm absolutely rubbish at it, there's something thoroughly enjoyable about having middle schoolers beat you up. And so it's been fun to watch both my son have that trajectory and then also just realize how much I was asking of him to take the class, because I'm now doing it myself and discovering how hard everything that looks easy really is. So that's added a lot of color to my current life.
Nice. So now that we've broken the barrier of seeing you not just as a scientist, but also as a human that has passions outside of work, let's kind of dive into your science a little bit. So my first question, which may not come as a surprise, is what questions excite you in your work? What questions are you currently pursuing?
Well, I have the difficulty of picking sometimes because part of the stage I'm at in my career is that I've worked on enough projects that I tend to sort of keep a few things running in parallel. But I've always tried to step back and ask myself which ones are kind of my most pressing interests, or are there kind of bridges between the different topics? But I'm highly motivated these days around the question of, do we really need to spend this much energy on the computational goals that we give ourselves? You know, we put a lot of money and time and energy resources into computations. And I'm not judging what we use our computations for. This isn't a judgment of sociology or something. You know, if you want to watch a cat video because it lifts you up, watch a cat video. But I'm really motivated by whether the algorithms and the hardware and the way we store the data, that holistic package, feels to me like it's been built little bits at a time and not thought from tail to tip. And so it's become something where we have a lot of extra work and energy being used on things that maybe we could streamline and get to a place where we just don't need to use that much energy to achieve the computations that we have. And that seems to be a thread in how I think of it. Now, it may not be how others see my work, but it's what I sort of get excited by, is thinking, would this help me improve upon something in that stack?
So I guess continuing a little bit along those lines, how does that question, and in general, how do you hope to impact the world?
Right. Yeah, I think any scientist has always wondered, is my stuff going to be used? So there's soft answers that we give ourselves when we need to sort of cheer ourselves up, that we've impacted the lives of people around us in various ways. And I think that's definitely true. And I've certainly watched some of my colleagues who are just really gifted at maybe mentoring or teaching, or they've created a cool invention that you can really see as making something more accessible to something else. But often it's sort of on the margins or side hustles that people actually become most useful. So you might discover that somebody just created a package as part of their research that helped them solve some particular problem. They maybe even just somehow simplified a description of something that was already known, very well known, but they just were a really good expositor or lecturer on it, and they just made it sound approachable, or they wrote a really good textbook on the subject area. So now they can actually teach it to students at a lower level. And I don't mean lower in like skill set, but just an earlier part of their career. And I think that one hopes that you're doing all those things. What you get excited by in the morning and where you think you're making the impact might not be those things. But I do believe that over the years, a lot of what's happening is that I'm just a person. Like I wonder at times, you know, how much would I be impacted, say, by ChatGPT or some other AI, downloading all the things I've ever written and then serving it out to people on a kind of question by question basis? Would that achieve the same thing as having me in person with the person? And what I've discovered is that my answers are always changing. They're always evolving based on new things, new inputs of the world around me, and they help me listen to the question and think, oh, well, I never thought of my work as asking that question, but now that you say it that way, let me give you a feedback. And so it's one of those moments where, at least right now, I feel like being alive and in person and available to answer those questions as a dialogue is incredibly different than just looking it up and finding it on Wikipedia. Because I don't think people want to solve the exact same question I solved. They want to solve the next one. They want to use what I was doing as a bridge to their own goal. And that transformation is not something I know how to do without just being there present. So I think mostly I just want people to feel like for the time that I'm here, they could reach out and write me a question and I would answer them. And I'm known to give these very long emails that have a lot more detail than was being asked, but it just like downloads whatever I know about the problem area. And the goal is that now they can go off and build it themselves or do what they like the most with it. So I think I don't know if I remember the question well enough, but it's something like, "Am I useful to the world?" And the answer is, I think that it has to do with thinking deeply about some problems, organizing, setting some goals for people. I think that's another strength of mine is to take the field around me and then say, oh, here are some open questions. Here are some things that we aren't doing or the places that we could be going, seeing a connection with an area that wasn't made. And then I'm usually not enough people to do it myself. I feel energetic at the moment. I feel like, oh, I'm going to get this one done. But then the truth is, it works much better to just drop into a collaboration, have a lot of people work on the same problem and take the idea and do it on their own. And you might even just fade to the background, never even be remembered. But you know that maybe that collaboration would have happened without some discussion that you had. So my own products might be very thin on the ground at some stage compared to what I think the impact could have been. And I think that's a good way to go with it.
Yeah, I would say like it's impactful that you are here, right? And you are important in your work, not just the work itself in general.
I'm hoping so. It keeps me going. So yeah, I certainly feel like it's the way to go. I mean, if we offer anything to each other, is that it's much more fun to talk to a person than to talk to ChatGPT. Um, we know this because we create social spaces any place we go. And so, I think it's also a lot of fun to have, moments of solitude where you get to go walk in the woods. There's lots of ways that we can enjoy it, but I think coming back to people helps a lot. And I think that's why in a classroom, we haven't replaced them all with AI. We still have a live person to teach people because those people need to have a point of contact to say, "Can I ask you a dumb question?" And then the person can say, you know what? Let's see if it is a dumb question. Let's try this out. Let's reshape the question into one that isn't dumb without insulting the person. I think ChatGPT will just reply with, it is a dumb question, and here's a dumb answer to it. And they won't say the word dumb, but they won't necessarily enrich the question with, oh, the question you're asking has an answer, but what if we changed it to one that doesn't have an answer? Now what would we learn? And that's something I don't know how to teach an AI to do right now.
Continuing on that note around people, if we think about it the other way, so you've talked about now your impact on the world. Let's think about it the other way of who's influenced you and who are people you look up to.
Right. So there's like answers that really do matter to me, but that don't make sense to anybody else. So if you would go to my website and try to find some of my materials, there's like a necessary login screen because some things are copyrighted material or whatever. And there's a simple like username and password you have to enter if you want to download certain content. And this is totally reasonable. It obeys copyright rules. But if you've been to my website, you would find out that you need to enter a specific person's name as the login, and that's a hint. That's somebody that has mattered to me in history. This guy called Phillip Hall, who was around in the 1920s through about 1940s was when he was active. And I just, as a student, I just read everything he had written, and it was just really useful to me to think his way. And I feel at least like I just stole a lot of his thinking. It was just, but I mean, in retrospect, it's very different. We probably couldn't have even talked to each other that well, or maybe I could have talked to him, but he would not have been able. Sorry, he could talk to me, but not the other way around because methods have diverged over the years. But so that's been somebody that I really appreciated the writing and the techniques and just the way of organizing information. That was really useful to me. Then there's been individuals that I think were really like, on the ground saw me. one of the first ones was a guy called Chris Genley. I was an intern. I started out as an intern at Intel, and in just the last year of high school, and then stayed through college. And you know, I thought I knew how to do things. I thought I was, like any high schooler, you're a little overconfident. I thought, yeah, I could program and so forth. And yeah, I could enough to get the internship is what I could do. But here was an actual engineer who knew how to do things, and he took sort of my overconfidence and without insulting me, just actually supplemented it with real training and was really, really like big on me and gave me space to try dumb ideas out and build things on my own. And I just really became really good at software just through having somebody just take that one-on-one mentorship. So much more than you get out of like a college education. I think software should be an apprenticeship, to be honest. Having done it in both ways, I can sort of say that's really the better thing to do is to just have a one-on-one mentor train you through software, and you'll come out the other end just having a different, you have a style as much as you have a skill set. And so that was a really important person. And then I wouldn't fail to mention Bill Kantor, who was my thesis advisor when I was doing my PhD, and just just brilliant at cutting through the BS, if I can say it on your podcast. So, I mean, the basics of, just, I remember I was really proud of something. I'd had like all these mentors in my life who had been really gracious about letting me try out ideas. And then I'm in grad school. And so I was just repeating the same thing. It's just like I'd read some, now dead author's work and then think, oh, I could go further. And I'd come back and I would show Bill my recent, advances, hoping that your parent says, oh, good job. Let's put that on the refrigerator, kind of, your emotional buildup that you want from life. And he would say, why does anybody care? And he would say it with an attitude like that. He's a very New Yorker. And it would just throw me. And I wasn't really insulted. I was just surprised. No one had really been honest with me that just because you can doesn't mean you should build this thing. And you shouldn't necessarily work this hard for whatever it is you're doing. And so the number of times that an idea that clearly had worked out, I had worked on I'd proved things, I'd made efforts, I'd worked hard to understand what was going on, and it would just be shot down as inconsequential. That was kind of some version of the phrase. And I thought at first, like, am I caught in some wormhole here where I'm just like not actually understanding what's important? But it was training. It was training to be judicious with your time. You're not going to work on every problem. And, the longer I've been in my business, the more I know you just don't have time to do it all yourself. So you've either got to decide that these problems are the ones that are worth your time, or you have to divide and conquer and bring in collaborators and convince them. But either way, you have to have a good reason to put your own time or their time behind something. And it makes you rethink, why am I just working on this? And it's a place I think is not that well. Well, I guess I see many of my colleagues don't do this as much as I would like them to. We tend to be in groupthink. We tend to just do the same things that we've been doing, that we were trained on. And it's difficult because it's scary to say, well, what if this is no longer useful? We've done what we needed to do in this space. We got to go somewhere new. And if we do that, are we going to lose our lead, our edge, our advantages on people? And I don't think that we're all like totally cerebral about it. It's small little moves, tiny little moves at a time. But if we don't retrain our thinking to sometimes back out and say, why am I doing this? Then we will end up just repeating little versions of the same idea over and over again. And at some point, it will just be a hamster wheel. So I really much appreciated Bill Kantor and just being a solid, he was just willing to ask the hard question about a lot of topics. Why are you applying there? When I was going up for jobs, like why do you care about that? If somebody else was doing something and I was sort of, and then one of the moments that he shared was really important to me. I was a young professor at the time. And one of the things I hadn't appreciated was that you have to learn how to write a grant. You have to learn how to write a grant that'll be successful. And it just doesn't happen. It's not because you don't have good ideas, it's because it's a competitive marketplace. And so I was writing grants and getting rejection letters, and they would say things in there. And I would start to sort of read into the criticism and think of it reflexively, like holding a mirror up of like, oh, yeah, but you must be like a bad researcher that you don't see what I'm doing is important, right? And I would get this bitterness, and I would sort of I didn't realize this, but almost every professional conversation I was having at conferences and other places, I would let this bitterness kind of leak out on the edges in small side jokes. If I had heard of somebody who might be in my general field got a grant that I thought their work wasn't as good as mine and I didn't get the grant that year, I was sort of just bitter about this in this negative way. And my advisor, Bill, I was well past being his student at that time, but um, he just called me out on it in like direct language. And I needed someone to do that because I was just not realizing, I was not hearing myself. And it colors everything you do if you're not. So I think advising like that is really important. You need to sometimes admit that you need that feedback to come both good and bad. And it was a temporary stage, and he was right to like call me out, reset, come back. Some people, the grant systems just never break their way. And other times I've been fortunate that it's broken my way in more situations than I probably deserved in some sense. But it's just a matter of the timing of the events that are around you help that work. But I think actually the real key was him saying, always focus on, is this important enough? Be gracious to the people who've been given that chance and stop assuming the world owes you more. These things they're all there, just give it a shot. And if it doesn't work out, just keep doing what you're doing, get better at it. And I think it was good advice for me at that age and that stage. Absolutely. So that said, I'm not sure it works for everybody. I think everybody needs it. If it comes to what makes you successful at grant, if that's what this podcast becomes, I have no credible advice here. It's a none of us.
Thank you. It's really important we talk about who influences us as well, not just how we influence the world, and can kind of move that forward and pay it forward as we go through. So I always love
Yeah.
hearing about who's influenced people from that perspective. So my next question is, how do you know if you've been successful at your work and as a scientist? What is your evaluation criteria?
So that's a really interesting question. So let me see if I'm going to repeat the question back to you. See if I actually understood it. You're saying, how do you know if you're being impactful, or was the word success measured in some other way? Maybe you want to ask me the question again.
So on some level, you get to choose, right? So I'm intentionally leaving success vague because I think it's up to you as a scientist to decide, right? As it's up to us to write these grants and up to us to do all of these
Yeah.
things. And so thinking about how do you know if you've been successful, right? Emphasis on you. And I would say that you're working as a scientist, right? And you can kind of interpret that how you want. And thinking about what is your evaluation criteria, kind of getting a little bit more specific if you've thought about kind of criteria specifically.
Well, so I think, okay, this might be field specific. So my answer is going to be me. And it'll be very interesting as your podcast goes on to see what other people say in this, because I really don't know what it's like for other people in other fields. But my field is not very strong on rewarding things. A few people get rewards, get like awards or whatever, and other fields, like every conference has a best paper or something like this. It's just different types of incentives for structures. And so my background in my field, it's not one, it speaks of the greats on the very top shelf, they get some prizes. And everybody else just kind of does their thing. So, I mean, there's probably in every young researcher a hope that your work will be recognized to the point of getting some kind of a prize. It'd be silly to pretend that doesn't happen in everyone's mind. But there's also, at least if you're able to be at all like realistic with yourself, once you've met one person from the top shelf, that's not going to happen for you too. So if you measure success solely by that, then you've there's a disconnect there, right? And I've been fortunate enough to be in the same spaces with various people who've won Nobel prizes and Fields medals and other kinds of prizes, and it's quite clear that a Turing Award winner is very different from a James Wilson, and a Fields Medal winner is very different, and a Nobel laureate is very different. And they're all like, some of them really know that they're a prize winner and they're rude to you, and others are just super kind. But the majority of them are super kind people. And so what you discover is you just do your own thing. So I didn't think of success as like a goal that was like prize. That's not been something I've really expected. And I just kind of kept my head down and just did things. And I measured success based on sort of local effects that I was going for. So if I wanted to run a conference, I wanted the people that I wanted to invite to say yes.
Mm.
And if I had a paper that I was just coming out with, I wanted it to get accepted. And if I was, um, talking to some student, thinking, wow, this is a really gifted student. I'd like to work with them. I wanted them to choose me back, if you will. Like those are small things that in your head feel like a success, but they're kind of a day-to-day success story because they come and they go, and you don't get them all, but you get enough of them in little breadcrumbs of things. And if you don't get the paper accepted into this journal, you look at the feedback and decide, was it just the wrong journal? Is it the wrong time to publish? Or is it just not actually as good a result? And am I finally able to see that with the light of day and realize, oh, I put the energy in, but it wasn't I didn't really calibrate properly. And you can feel kind of normal. Weird things have happened in my life where other people tell me this is a successful story, that I didn't know at the time was successful. For one, I got this job. I'm in my office right now, and a number of people go through the profession, get a PhD, and then struggle or try a lot of temporary jobs for a long period. And I didn't have that struggle. I was able to go from one job to the next. I mean, there was small little windows when you're searching that you don't know what's going to hook the next piece, but they were never like years-long battles. I was very privileged to have that happen. And, that felt like a successful story. At one point during that same little bitterness phase, I became sort of aware without noticing it that I had never talked to my boss about a raise. Just we'd go in, we'd have meetings. I was like hesitant to talk about whether I'd published enough papers and been to enough conferences and done all the things that are markers for moving up into tenure and so forth. It was just like, am I growing the way that I'm being measured? And you're super scared because you don't know what's going to happen. It just never occurred to me to advocate for my salary. And so right after I had this conversation about stop being bitter and things like this, I just thought, well, I should just look at where things are. And it turns out that without having done anything, I was actually the top earner in my bracket. And that had just happened through incremental sort of, the professionals around me said, hey, something you're doing is working for us. And my annual evaluations have been really positive. And I hadn't realized, I had sort of thought maybe that's normal, but it was just happening. And I wasn't comparing myself to anybody. My wife has a great story that she could confirm, but I'll just tell it to you from my eyes. But I think she tells the story roughly the same way. Um, we were at the Columbus Museum of Art one day, and they had these puzzles set out, and they were puzzles of the different artworks that were on the wall. And you were allowed to just do one of the puzzles. And so I saw a puzzle and I put it together, and I thought it was nice. And then I walked away. And then this commotion broke out. And I couldn't figure out. And it turns out that these were timed puzzles. And if you got the shortest time, you got a prize. And I didn't know it was a timed puzzle. I just did the puzzle for fun, but I had apparently won. I'd done it much faster than the previous times, and so I won this prize. I got a gift card. I got my wife some earrings from the
Nice.
gift shop, and I'm convinced to this day, had I gone in knowing it was a competition, it would be nowhere near a winning time. It was the lack of pressure that made it successful. So I think success for me has been just accept that the things in your life that you're happy about count as success. Don't go looking for it. Don't set yourself up that I must make this goal to be successful. It's good to have goals to sort of point to, especially when you're writing grants or you're thinking, what am I going to do now that I've got tenure, I've become a full professor? What do I use my time on? Am I going to be a better teacher? Something like that. Those are things that are important to do, but I don't think that you want to measure success as like this prize, this paper, and all these things in a way that really pressures you. You really want to just say, oh, how did this work out? And realize that actually you've been successful because, you're choosing to see your life as a happy one rather than the other way around. And so I think I'm successful because I'm choosing to think that way. Maybe that's the final answer I got. Yeah, I got
Yeah,
there.
no, that works. I don't disagree with you. I think having lack of pressure is really helpful, right? When we're pressured, it makes it harder to do it. And so I'm just kind of curious how people measure themselves in terms of success. And I think it's a very top of the mind topic around science, right? And trying to think about its impact on the world at large.
Well, and
And
it's
not just the world, but kind of you too.
I mean, you've probably experienced this yourself that you aren't intending to compete in something, but then you discover you
Yeah.
are in a competition. You hear that
Yep.
somebody else is working on a similar result or that the timelines for certain things have come up and you're now competing with some other group that's applying for a same kind of grant or something. All of a sudden you are in competition, and then success will be measured by who got it. And
Yeah.
so it's not like you can avoid the outward pressures of success. But I think if anything, I'm saying you want to frame your mindset to retroactively tell yourself what was successful, rather than hang your hat on the previous. You predict success will mean this, and if your prediction doesn't come true, what happens is depression.
Mhm.
But if instead you sort of look backwards and say, well, how did I get here? Isn't this
Mhm.
great? You can actually see success in more nuanced ways. But I know that doesn't work for everybody. Like some people really like a big piece of value added, or they'll have a family member that doesn't see what they're doing as important until they reach some goal. I don't want to tell them that that's how they should experience success. I know that the pressures are very different for everybody. I was lucky to be around supportive people who've
Mhm.
been willing to let me feel successful in what I called success, regardless of whether they would have.
Yeah, and I think another important piece is small wins, right? Paying attention to the small things and really celebrating them and letting those add up too. What has been your most surprising result?
So most surprising to me or to the community? Maybe I'll answer both ways. So to me, I made an example that was in answer to I went to a conference. I was given a question by like the headliner at the conference, a guy called Laci Babai, about whether you could do something or other. And technical details don't matter, but it was a challenge question, and I had a feeling that it could be done, that there were reasons this couldn't be done, but I didn't have an immediate answer, and it sounded like it'd be challenging. So then at the end of the conference, this person said, um, conjecture that it can be done, like that this is a theorem, in fact. And so I happened to be riding back on the train with him. We're friends, and I just said, I don't think you should make that conjecture. It's not going to be correct. And I think just out of like, what's a youngster telling this experienced, major name? He pulls out a notepad from his backpack and just slaps it on the train table that we had. Like on the trains in Germany have little tables in them. And he says, well, prove it. And so I did what you would do in that moment, right? It was just I just put my head down and pretend that I'm just calculating something to sort of like feel like, oh my gosh, now I've put my foot in it. I've committed myself to an opinion that isn't really researched. And I've got like what, till 45 minutes till this train stops to get out of this misery. In one of those weird miracles of how things work, I actually found a proof of what was being asked on the train ride. Like this doesn't happen to me. This doesn't happen to anybody. This is just one of those everything I had spent years working on this kind of problem, and all the intuition was there. I just hadn't been pressured to do it. So I came up with these, and then it was just a lovely result that basically kind of puts the brakes on a whole technique in our field. It just says there is a limit to how much this other technique can go. It cannot go beyond this line, and it's a definitive answer. There's like a calibration for how close to this limit is. It's at the limit, so it's like it completely ends the conversation, and it felt really good because we're friends, and it was like it was a rivalry, but in a good way. And so I was happy to have that moment. That result I'm really happy about. It's called profiles. Threshold for profiles is logarithmic. That's the paper. Surprising to the community, I think there's one that I did with a graduate student and a postdoc that I met when I was in Israel as a postdoc. Uriya First is well, now he's a professor, but he was a postdoc at the time, and Josh Maglione, my graduate student at the time. And this just has to do with recasting a whole bunch of different fields as kind of connected to each other through what's called a tensor polynomial operator correspondence. It just sort of says that people who've been looking at things like a data scientist might look at a grid of numbers and think of that as something, or a geometer might call that a tensor. That piece of data is the same as what an algebraist would call polynomial algebraic geometry. And that turns out to be the same as something else called operator theory, which you might see, say, more in analysis or something like that. So these areas turn out to be one and the same and transferable, and you can walk between them, and you learn new things by going between them. And that's been a surprise, and we're still digging into what that means. And a lot of us are sort of happy to have this big playground to play with where we can go move our cars from each little neighborhood to each other's neighborhood.
Yeah, so that's actually an example of when pressure can be good, right? That
Yeah,
it finally
sure.
forced you to actually do something. So kind of
That's
full
right.
circle there in a fun way. What is your favorite disagreement? And maybe you kind of answered it a little bit where you had a disagreement with a surprise result, but maybe you want to expand on that or add
Yeah,
another
I
story.
disagree with the foundations of most of the sciences that I was taught. So just basic assumptions that people make. There's this law called the law of the excluded middle, which says that, something is either true or it's false. And I'm more nuanced about that. I think there's room for things to be kind of a mix of both, or maybe true and false at the same time. So yeah, that's a very low propensity point of view, but I have my reasons, and I disagree with those who have different reasons.
But I like asking that question because I think it really gets at the other big piece of science. It's not just about questions, but it's also being in conversation and disagreeing with each other and trying to tease out what's really going on in there for many different reasons. If you could do anything, not limited by grants or other factors in your space, what would you be doing? What is your vision for the world?
Well, I don't know if I go as wide as the world, but I will say that a realistic problem right now is that I would love to just work on the research questions that I'm interested in and make the teaching that I do be to get people able to work on the problem.
Mm,
Right now, I feel like my time gets split on teaching legacy things that maybe were important in the 1950s, and it's harder to convince myself and certainly the students that they are still as important. So I would love to have a space in which you still have curriculum, you still have training, but you're training much more to the edge of science, to the contemporary edge of science, that there's a fluidity there to do that. And then that as you start to see people build excitement, that there's resources to come alongside that student and say, okay,
mm,
that's funded. Just keep working on it, and you take as
mm,
much time as it needs, maybe you have to put some parameters in there that they have merit and so forth, but that you could really think not of these kind of rigid, this is a lump sum and this has got to be done by this date, but rather you say, okay, so we have to build out this science, and some sciences should be quick and return results quickly and be useful and prove their value. But others are given a longer runway to run through ideas and maybe new supports. I would love an institute that has the ability to bring in both some people who have a lot of experience to do that sort of thing, but also the youngsters who want to try to do this. Because
mm,
right now I sort of sense there's a divide. There's the institutes that take the top shelf people and put them into boxes so they don't have any teaching duties and don't have to be distracted by anything, and they're given gigantic breakthrough grants or whatever to just work on just what they're doing. But then the only people that join them are other people from that shelf, and so it kind of
mm,
becomes a group think. I want those youngsters to be able to come through and then take it wherever they want to go. So I still like that kind of institution that has a teaching component to it, but
mm,
not the strictures of a university where it's very much this has to be done by this date and you have to do this to graduate, and then we'll give you a certificate, but you will have been certified on techniques that aren't being used. So something that's I think it has to be a newly thought model, to be honest. That's what I would think would work well. You could
mm.
involve industries that have their goals as kind of help with the funding sources. Anyway, I'm not thought this through. I'm not somebody who's ready to build an institute. But if there was an institute, I think that's the kind of model it would have to be sustainable. It would have to be not just bringing the best minds together, but also bringing young minds through on a regular basis to be mentored into a program and given a chance to invent it their own way. And then your teaching is always about filtering to that group of people and restructuring it. You might never teach the same course twice because you don't have the same students twice.
Yeah,
That's
I truly don't disagree with you. I think like a big something that always frustrated me about undergrad is did it actually prepare me for grad school? Right. On some levels, I think yes, I got in. So clearly somebody said yes from that success measure. And then when I got to grad school, though, I didn't know any of the questions, right? I pretty quickly identified that to get a PhD is to ask a question and answer to some extent with some novelty in some piece of that, which is why I love questions in general and have kind of made that my whole thing. But in that, right, we don't actually teach the questions, right? I feel like a lot of my undergrad was really kind of trying to focus on facts, which you obviously need a fact base or a knowledge base at large. but how do we foster the curiosity to really kind of bridge the gap? I think we don't have that just yet, which is kind of what you're getting at. And my hope is that some of this podcast stuff will get there too, that this could be really useful for people in high school, college, graduate school who want to see that scientists are real people, right? And also really understand how scientists think about themselves too, and how we can all be better scientists through that process. And for me, like that's really what the science of science is what I really study. So I really appreciate you answering my questions. Just to be really clear, right, James did not know my questions ahead of time. So all of this was candid. And part of my whole point of this podcast is that scientists are quite passionate about what they do, right? And if you ask them those questions or ask them to share those questions, that passion will just come through, and they don't need actual time to think about it because they have thought about it. They just have never necessarily vocalized it. So that's really the goal of this podcast at large. And so with that, I'm sure maybe everyone's waiting or maybe has guesses. If you'd like to reintroduce yourself, kind of this introduction of your name, and then your field, and anything else you'd like to say that would introduce yourself or outroduce yourself.
Okay. I'm James Wilson. I'm a professor of mathematics at Colorado State University. And in my profession, I've had stints both as a research mathematician and as a lecturer, teacher of mathematics, but also working in industry, mostly in computer and computational industries as a consultant and advisor and adjunct faculty for various think tanks, and you heard I worked at Intel for a while. So I've always had my hand in both computation and mathematics, and this is my passion. So yeah, thanks for listening.
James thinks about computation and its energy costs and asks, do we really need to use all this energy? For example, DeepSeek has shown us otherwise for AI, or artificial intelligence. One goal could be to do less but better, as said in the book Essentialism by Greg McKeown and in the book Quit by Annie Duke. As James said, maybe we need to rethink how we use our time, energy, and more. How do you choose to spend your time and energy? To learn more about James Wilson and any cited or named people, take a look at the episode description. Thank you for listening to the first episode. Please follow the Ignorance Podcast wherever you get your podcasts to learn about science through research questions.